We move ahead now to the attack of 2001, and if Mullah Omar wasn't aware of the cost of his support for bin Laden before then, he certainly would have learned very quickly what was going to come. What's your sense of the Afghan government's involvement or knowledge of the 2001 plot? And then, of course, its reaction to the event and its anticipation of what the U.S. would do before the actual American attack started.
I don't know what bin Laden had shared with Mullah Omar and the Taliban about the planning. What we do know is that almost immediately after that, the Taliban were approached primarily through the Pakistanis about turning over bin Laden. And apparently there was a brief period of debate amongst the Taliban leadership. And some, again, claimed to have advocated for turning over bin Laden. But Mullah Omar made the decision that this was not something that he could do, and that it was against his ideology and against his ethics and against these tribal codes of housing people who have sought sanctuary. Although it's important to note that the tribal codes, of course, don't actually protect murderers and things like that. But this is the story that's played out. And that Mullah Omar very quickly essentially decides to go down with the ship. He knows that there's an invasion coming, and he refuses and says that we will go into hiding and we will wage a guerrilla campaign against the Americans. And so they very quickly made that decision.
Now, the fall of the Taliban government comes rather quickly, and there's a moment, as the story is told, of the escape from Tora Bora of bin Laden and presumably of the leadership of the Taliban as well. That's always been described, at least as I know it, as a moment where there simply weren't enough American troops on the ground, and the back door was held open essentially by either Afghan tribesmen or Pakistani military who simply let Al-Qaeda and Taliban leadership slip away. Is that your understanding of essentially what happened?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a decision on the part of the U.S. government to put in a very limited number of American forces into Afghanistan initially. We worked almost exclusively through proxies, and those proxies, of course, were the militia forces that we talked about earlier that had fought the Civil War against each other. And that is happening simultaneously with the fact that although we did go to General Musharraf, then the president of Pakistan, to say, you know, the famous "you're with us, you're against us," and that he pledges that Pakistan will actually assist the fight against the Taliban, in reality, we have this 20-year history coming previously where the Pakistani military and the Pakistani intelligence services are all geared up essentially to support first the Mujahideen and then the Taliban. So you go from one day where all of these guys are supporting the Taliban, they've created this group that takes over the country, to literally a few weeks later when they're supposed to abandon those ties. And of course they didn't, as we know now. They didn't abandon those ties. And so all of these people were relatively easily able to just bleed across the border and go into hiding in Pakistan.
Now we have today, as you mentioned, the reemergence of these various tribal militias, their leaders being power brokers in present-day Afghanistan. It raises all kinds of questions as to, having failed to come to some kind of a concord among themselves previously, is there hope for what they might be able to arrive at in terms of maintaining a unified state and allegiance to that state into the future?
I think the biggest problem about the presence of the warlords or militia commanders in the new Afghan government since 2001 has been that they do not abide by the rule of law. They acted in the past with impunity, having committed war crimes, and since 2001 have continued to do so. They They have stolen government lands, government-owned enterprises. They maintain illegal militia forces. They've created grave abuses. They've undermined the political system. And the problem is not so much that they're fighting each other, because at the moment there's mostly a lid on that conflict. The problem is that they are so undermining the Afghan government through corruption and destruction of the legitimacy of the government, that the government is having a very hard time getting up on its feet and becoming effective and respected in the eyes of its own citizens. And when you don't have a government that's respected in the eyes of its own citizens, people will start looking for alternatives. And so I think one of the reasons that the Taliban insurgency has grown in strength so much in the last 4 years, since 2004, 2005, is not because the Taliban insurgency is so powerful itself, but because the Afghan government is so weakened.